Hello and welcome to Connected on TaiwanPlus. Now, we could be considered privileged here, an international news channel in one of the freest countries in the world. But journalists everywhere around the globe are facing more risk each day as they do their work. In fact, the United Nations has called journalism one of the world's most dangerous professions. How has it come to this? Well, both Peter Greste in Brisbane, Australia, and Dhanya Rajendran, who is in Kochi in the state of Kerala, are here to share their experience and their insight. Peter, I'm going to start with you. You are with Macquarie University, a former journalist, and you are the chair for the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. Tell us more about the work you do.
Yeah, look, I'm really interested in protecting media freedom around the world. It really started with my own journey when in 2013 I was arrested in Egypt on terrorism charges. And I was working for Al Jazeera. I think you will remember that very well yourself. And I came to recognize that what had happened to us was really an example, a fairly egregious example, but an example nonetheless of what was taking place around the world. Literally hundreds and hundreds of journalists have been imprisoned, and most often on terrorism and anti-state charges. When I was finally released after 400 days, I started the organisation you just mentioned, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, and I've been advocating for media freedom ever since, both across the region, the Asia-Pacific region, and around the world, but also here in Australia, where even though it doesn't always look like it, we've got some fairly serious media freedom issues to fight for as well.
And Dhanya, you are a journalist too. You are the founder of the portal The News Minute and the chairperson of DigiPub News India Foundation, which is India's biggest digital-only news association. Can you tell us more?
Hi, Divya. Thank you for having me on the show. So the News Minute was founded in 2014. We are a website which focuses on the south of India. I mean, to people outside India, they could wonder as to why the focus on the south of India. India's a large country where people behave differently, think differently. The politics is different in many places. So we cover 5 states in the south. About DigiPub, India has seen a boom in digital news in the last few years. We have around, I think, 200 websites, news websites across the country in different languages. I mean, this is just a number that I have put. I'm not sure. But DigiPub has around 100 to 120 members. And these are digital-only portals which are languages across the country.
Right. I want to start with this damning indictment from the World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development Global Report. That's a mouthful. This is for the year 2021 to 2022. It's a report by UNESCO. It says over the past 5 years, approximately 85% of the world's population experienced a decline in press freedom in their country. Now, Peter, I want to start with you and ask you what you think is behind this disturbing trend.
Look, I tend to go back to 9/11 as the turning point, the real moment when things really started to go bad for journalists. If you have a look at the graph of journalists who've been imprisoned over the past 30 years, what you'll see is that there was a bit of a surge in the 90s and then a fairly steady decline until the year 2000, 2001, and then it started to take off. And the latest statistics from the Committee for the Protection of Journalists suggest that we now have a record number of journalists behind bars. If you break it down, what you see is that most journalists are there on anti-state charges. So that's charges related to things like terrorism, sedition, treason, crimes of breaches of national security, and so on. And I think that's because what 9/11 did was change the nature of the conflict, or nature of conflict generally, from a conflict, what we saw previously were a lot of conflicts over tangible things like land or ethnicity, water, and so on, things that you could put your finger on. And those kinds of conflicts, journalists are observers rather than participants. It's still dangerous, but you're not necessarily seen as directly involved. 9/11 became a war over ideas, over isms, a conflict between Western ideas of liberal democracy and ideas of Islamic theocracy. And in that contest of ideas, the battlefield extends to the place where ideas themselves are transmitted. And so what we saw were governments passing a whole range of national security legislation, all in the name of fighting the war on terror. But those legislation would often include things like or loosening definitions around terrorism, around advocating terrorist ideology. It would expand to controlling the message, controlling the flow of information. And in that kind of framework, journalists are particularly vulnerable. And what we've seen is, as a result of this, is governments using that national security legislation being used as an excuse to lock up journalists for uncomfortable reporting.
Now, Dhanya, I'm sure that resonates hugely in India, where you're seeing this kind of a trend happening now with more access to information than ever. Why is India one of the places where the space for freedom of expression is shrinking and has shrunk remarkably over the past few years?
In India, primarily two laws used to be used against journalists, which is criminal defamation and civil defamation. We know we still hang on to the old British laws, though Britain has abolished criminal defamation. We still have it. I think till a few years ago, these were the two main laws which were used against journalists. But over the last few years, we have seen multiple laws like sedition. There's a draconian law called UAPA, which is basically used against terrorists. There are so many different laws now being used against journalists by the government, union government, the central government, and also by different state governments whenever needed. So I think there is a lot of government clampdown on news, and there is, of course, political parties reacting adversely to news. So there is, I think, an atmosphere of intolerance, and that keeps growing. And especially it is towards digital news, because what we are seeing in India is also a shift where television, largely English television, is more subservient to what the government says. They do not, they have sort of forgotten that the tenet of journalism is for public good and that we need to speak up what is public good. So a lot of focus remains on what newspapers and digital sites do. And there has been a clampdown. So when governments find it uncomfortable, all laws are being invoked, and journalists are paying the price for speaking the truth, for speaking to power.
Evan Gershkovich is a reporter. He's a U.S. citizen, and he was arrested while working in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg for the Wall Street Journal. He's been charged by the Russian government with espionage and could face up to 20 years in prison. But first, I would like to talk about your tweet here, Peter. This is an attack on a journalist doing his job, pure and simple. I know what it's like. Peter, can you explain?
I was arrested back in 2013, December of 2013, when I was in Egypt covering the unfolding political crisis there. At the time, there was a lot of tension between the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, who the military had ousted 6 months earlier in a coup, and supporters of the interim government that had been installed by the military. The interim government was organising fresh elections. It was writing a new constitution. It had started accusing the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terror. But the Brotherhood hadn't formally been banned. And so what we were doing was what I guess any responsible journalist would have been doing, and that's talking to all of the parties involved in that political row. And that included the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, we were doing what I'd consider to be fairly conservative journalism, but the government clearly disagreed, and my hotel room was raided on December 28th of 2013. I was arrested and charged with, along with two of my colleagues, two Egyptians, and we were charged with aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, financing terrorism, broadcasting false news of intent to undermine national security, a whole host of very, very serious charges. We really struggled for a while with understanding what had happened until I realised that this wasn't about anything that we'd done, but it was about what we'd come to represent. So the government had done pretty much what Dhanya was just speaking about, using loosely framed national security legislation to shut down uncomfortable journalism. And this is exactly what I saw when I heard about Evan, that the government, the Russian government, had used national security legislation to go after what was clearly uncomfortable reporting, critical, honest, good, straight, but critical reporting by a very, very good journalist who understood the country well. I think it's deeply troubling. I know exactly what he will be feeling at this moment, and it's not going to be pleasant for him. He's going to go through a fairly rough period.
I remember at the time, more than 10 years ago, Peter, when you were behind bars in Egypt, we would get news almost every day of, there was going to be another hearing, another trial, and we'd sit with bated breath. and I at the anchor desk at the time in Doha for Al Jazeera would have to announce then saying that your sentence or your time behind bars would be extended, just like Peter. Bail denied time and time again. Can you tell us what he possibly could be going through his mind at this point?
Look, I think by now he will have come to terms with the fact that he's been arrested on some very serious charges. I mean, the first reaction of anybody is denial, is to say, oh, look, this will be over shortly. There'll be some fairly robust phone calls from fairly senior diplomats and media officers, and I'll be kicked out of the country and they'll all be over fairly soon. But by now he will be understanding that this is going to take quite a long time to resolve. I know that he's already had some visits from the ambassador, the American ambassador to Russia. He's had some consular visits. So he will be aware of the level of support, the global support that his story has been getting, the global attention that his story has been getting. I think that will be absolutely vital, because it's the thing that becomes really debilitating is the sense that you've been forgotten about, that nobody is fighting for your corner, that you're isolated and alone. And as long as he understands that, I think he will be able to hold on to the notion that there are people that are out there that have got his back. I also hope that he recognises that his case has become emblematic of this wider struggle for press freedom, that it isn't simply about him or what he's done, but that he now represents a much more significant struggle for the whole principle of media freedom. I certainly came to that conclusion, and it was absolutely vital in me maintaining my own mental health, my own sanity.
All right, this is the point where we're bringing some of those hard numbers. At the beginning of December, a record 363 journalists were behind bars. That's a 20% increase since 2021. Peter, give us some perspective on this. You talked about countries using national security laws and other vague and draconian laws to put journalists behind bars. Do you see more of a trend of that happening? Yeah,
absolutely. Look, if you look at the world's greatest or most prolific jailers of journalists, the countries like Iran, which has been imprisoning journalists over the coverage of the headscarf protests. China has been locking up dozens of journalists, and most of them for their reporting of the crisis in Xinjiang, the pressure on the Uyghur communities. Again, around using national security as an excuse. Turkey has been also incredibly prolific. Ever since the failed attempted coup a few years ago, Turkey has been locking up all sorts of critics, academics, writers, and journalists, again, accusing them of being involved with terrorism. This is what happened to me, as I mentioned earlier, in Egypt, me and my colleagues. We were there on terrorism charges. And I think it's this conflation of journalism with national security, or as a threat to national security in some form, which is really deeply troubling. Remember, 9/11 gave politicians an excuse, an opportunity to use national security, to frame national security as an all-encompassing and vital imperative for them. I've seen nothing in recent years that has seen a movement away from that trend. If anything, it's getting worse. And what we're seeing more recently is a lot of very, very powerful surveillance tools, digital surveillance tools, being used to further that pressure, that assault on journalism. Combined, I think it's been deeply, deeply troubling. And the net effect is to really put pressure on democracies. Remember, we're talking about journalism, of course, and we're talking about World Press Freedom Day, but this isn't about journalists per se. It's about the role that journalism plays in a broader community. And as Dhanya was saying earlier, when journalists are under pressure, what that does is allow much more scope for politicians, for governments to behave unethically, to behave in corrupt ways. It degrades public debate, it degrades public oversight of those governments, of those people in power. And that's really where this matters. It's not about us, it's about the people that journalists serve, the audiences, the readers who live in those democracies and depend on good journalism for their understanding of what their governments are up to.
Divya, if I can jump in here on the question of national security.
Please do.
I think national security is a word that really is undefined as governments go. In the rules that govern digital media, for example, it said that if something is against national security, the government has emergency powers to block a URL, to take down a website, etc. But national security is a word that is being used and overused by governments and for a public which believes in hyper-nationalism. They're also not able to differentiate. Is this channel really acting against national security? What is national interest? So I think these are the terms that governments just throw around so that they can actually book journalists and also evoke a suspicion in the minds of the public, in the minds of the critics that, okay, maybe there is definitely some issue of national security that we do not know about.
Dhanya, I'm just going to jump in here too, because I remember when I was shortly after the 9/11, a good friend of mine joked that George W. Bush, when he declared the war on terror, had just declared war on an abstract noun. I mean, it means whatever anybody really wants it to mean. And as you said, that definitional problem around what really is national security, what really is terrorism, has been a hugely contentious issue. And it is the fuzziness of those terms has been used by governments in exactly the way that you've just described, not just in India, but all over the world. In Egypt, disrupting a civil servant from performing his duties is considered to be an act of terror. If you threaten the integrity of the state, whatever that means, you can be accused of being involved in an act of terrorism. And I think that fuzziness combined with the other elements you've just described, and that's the ability of governments to say, well, we can't tell you what the evidence is because if we expose that evidence, then we further undermine national security. So you have to trust us. This is a question of national security. We need to lock these people up. And I think that's really, really serious.
To emphasize how vulnerable journalists are, between 2018 and 2022, 359 journalists across the world were killed for doing their jobs. And these numbers are just what's being reported, but countless others are working in conditions where their safety is at risk on a daily basis. Now, there are many possible ways of showing that risk to the public, but as authoritarians arm themselves with technology, activists and organizations are fighting back with creativity and imagination. We recently spoke to Toby Natterer. He's one of the talents behind the Minecraft map, the uncensored library commissioned by Reporters Without Borders. Minecraft is possibly the most successful game in history, with over 100 million active players. And the library allows them to access censored articles and learn about press freedoms. Take a look.
And then you would basically head towards the dome where there's the press freedom index at the bottom, where you can see what is the current press freedom situation in different countries by color. So white or light yellow is quite good and black is pretty bad. So yeah, over there you can see China has a very bad press freedom situation, also Saudi Arabia and some countries in Africa. Obviously North Korea. So yeah, you get it, like at one glance, you get an impression of the press freedom situation around the world. So we started with 5 rooms with 5 countries, and then we kind of like updated the library constantly. So now there's more rooms. The beginning of each room, let's say the entrance of each room, has a book explaining what country you're about to enter, what is the current press freedom situation in this country, and a bit of an explanation for the installation in each room to make each room not look the same and make it a bit more interesting.
I see there are rooms for Vietnam, there are rooms for Russia, but being a Taiwan-based journalist, I have to ask, why not China?
So we did a project for Reporters Without Borders before this project, where China was featured. So on the one hand, we wanted to feature different countries. And on the other hand, China has, we have a bit of a Minecraft problem in China because China has its own Minecraft. They kind of like, they're not allowing the normal Minecraft. So to the left, we find Mexico. And Mexico is actually the country with the most journalists killed per year. So yeah, we highlighted some of the journalists that got murdered in Mexico. And yeah, we highlighted their story and the backgrounds, or let's say the research what they were investigating, it is often connected to drug trafficking and corruption.
What do you think is the role of creativity in protecting freedoms in general and press freedom specifically?
I mean, differently speaking, there's also a lot of creativity in censorship. So governments find every year, they find new ways of censoring information. New technologies are developed to censor journalism. So I think, finding creative ways to beat firewalls, to find loopholes, to get independent information back into countries where it's censored. I think creativity can play a huge role here and is a very important part in it. Just for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, people and a lot of things got censored in Russia, and there was a real hard crackdown on the media, and people found out that Google Maps was not censored, and they started to write restaurant reviews on Google Maps that contained independent news, and therefore smuggle them back into the country.
Dhanya, they talk about censorship in that piece there and ways of getting around it, but there's a huge issue in India, particularly with the rise in social media attacks and harassment, with journalists censoring themselves so that they're not open to these kinds of attacks. Can you tell us what that's doing to the media landscape there and to reporting in many parts of India?
So I think we can divide this into two segments. One is how do journalists react personally and how do organizations react, right? So in India, there is a lot of mass organized harassment. To quickly explain, let's say I put out a tweet or I put out a story from my handle, or just something my personal opinion from my handle. What happens? The tweet gets circulated in WhatsApp groups, Telegram groups. And when I say groups, I don't mean a group with 100 people or 50 people. You're talking about groups spread across states, groups with thousands thousands of people in these various groups, and then they descend on your timelines, criticizing you, abusing you, harassing you. And I've noticed that this goes on for 24 hours or 48 hours per tweet. So what happens to journalists who just come into the industry, and even senior journalists, is that they're not able to cope with this kind of mass abuse, of mass targeting. I've seen so many journalists feeling very worried for their safety, for their physical safety, for their mental health, and also they end up self-censoring on social media is one. And sometimes I feel it also impacts their work. But still, the harassment and the abuse online, I do believe, does determine to a large extent how people report, what they report, and how much they censor.
Now, Peter, we're coming close to the end of this program, and I want to talk about using social media, but I want to change tack here and talk about using it for good, as we've seen the campaigns for your release from the Egyptian jail, for Evan too, from the Wall Street Journal. One would think that regimes really don't care about public opinion and what's being said on social media, but can you tell us if it has a role to play in helping these situations and putting a spotlight on these injustices?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that it does. I think it makes a huge difference. I mean, governments will say that they don't pay attention to social media. They'll pretend that it's of no relevance to them whatsoever what the rest of the world thinks. But they do worry about it. It matters to them. Their own reputation overseas and internationally really does make a difference. And so when you see these huge social media campaigns building up, even though simply retweeting a message or including a hashtag in a tweet might not feel like much, but it does add collectively to the pressure. And so in all sorts of ways, both directly and indirectly, social media pressure does make a difference.
Go on, Dhanya.
Yeah, I think all governments, and it's not just governments, right? Political parties and many vested interests, they keep, especially governments, I would say, keep discrediting. That is their job now. Discredit human rights activists, discredit human rights organizations, discredit journalists, discredit media organizations. That can be quite stressful. But as Peter was saying, it is important that we keep the dialogue up, that we keep the conversation going, and that even if the government behaves like it does not it is not bothered about the criticism. At the end of the day, the fact that this conversation is going on, that this criticism is going on online, does bother them. Therefore, even if it's a small section of people who want to speak up against this, I think they will have to keep going on. And if that pressure is not built up, if we do not bring international attention into an issue happening within our country, then that is going to get more difficult. So we really have to keep the conversation going. And I think social media, yes, though I'm one of those journalists who is abused a lot, who's harassed a lot, I would like to see the positive side of social media where people do come together. People who I do not even know would voice for me, would voice for Peter. People from across countries would have asked for his release, right? So that is what we have to keep channeling, because at one side, when governments discredit us, on the other side, we have to keep these voices going.
Indeed, and it takes a collective effort to preserve freedom of speech, and we should all stay informed and push back against those who are trying to limit our freedoms. A huge thank you to my guests, Peter Greste in Brisbane, Australia, Dhanya Rajendran, who is currently in Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala. Thank you both for your time, your thoughts, your insight. Thank you so much for the work that you do that is so important in keeping everyone informed and making sure that we all hold the people that we should accountable. And thank you to our viewers. It's been great to have your company. Stay connected.